This morning, as we continue with Genesis, what a great study we're starting. What I want to do is talk about passages in how the New Testament, and I'll abbreviate that NT, how the New Testament affirms aspects of the creation, okay? And I want to start with, let's turn to the passage, Colossians, no, let's turn to the passage John 1 through 3. And we're going to work down through some of these because they're all very critical passages and ones that are just so important as we think about the Christian view of the world and God's place in it and how it's such an important part of our faith. John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. And in him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not comprehended it or understood it. It's really amazing. I ran across a Christian writer years ago that made a comment that's been important to me in my Bible study. When you read verses, he says, one of the things that we need to pay attention to is the grammar of the verses. And the point that he was making is sometimes we overlook the power of prepositions. And I want to talk about that because it comes up here in this opening paragraph in ways that are pretty astounding. I'm going to give you a pop quiz question for your grammar. What is a preposition? Nancy, the teacher, what did you tell your students a preposition was?
A preposition is a word that shows relationship.
So preposition, behind, before, after, in, within, outside of, I don't know that I've ever seen an exhaustive list of our English prepositions. There's a ton of them. So let's look at the prepositions and how they function in John 1. They're really incredible. Notice the very first word. In the beginning was the word. The preposition in. So if we're talking about relationship, what does this first phrase mean with that preposition in placed right as the very first word in the Gospel of John? What's being affirmed here? In relationship, time-wise, and we're going to talk about his participation in a minute because there's going to be another preposition used. But in relationship to time, in the beginning was the Word. Now, with this, two things are very important. Notice that this word, if your Bible's like mine, it capitalizes the word word. The W is a capital W. When you read that, what are you thinking?
Jesus.
We think Jesus, don't we? Now, in the Greek text, it's interesting. It's not capitalized, and it's just the word logos. We get our word logic from that word. But what's interesting is the Gospel of John is going to take what were, in his day, contemporary philosophical words, reframe them with Jesus. In the ancient world, when you were looking for the meaning of life, purpose, those kind of discussions about why we're here, how are you supposed to live, and all of that. Well, the philosophers had this ongoing discussion about what logos was. What is the purpose of life? What is that final word that kind of gives you the core purpose of your living? And boy, they really struggled to figure that out. What Jesus claims is what no ancient philosopher ever dared to claim. This is what's so cool. Remember where Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Oh my, nobody ever claimed that. Not only that, John chapter 1, this first paragraph identifies Jesus as the Word, that core idea of existence and meaning and purpose. That's who he was. Well, no philosopher would ever been identified with being the definition of what Logos was. So in the Gospel of John, it's going to be really astounding about the claims of Jesus. Yeah, this is a good point to bring it up. In John 3:16, it's interesting that probably starting since the translation of the New Revised Standard Version, or the Revised Standard Version in 1947, that translation committee took John 3:16 and translated it that Jesus is the unique Son of God. Well, it raised a lot of controversy because the word begotten wasn't used there. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to erase, Jesus' divine relationship as the only begotten Son of God. Well, that wasn't the issue. The word that's there, that's used by John, it sort of means unique, and it means something like one and only. And it doesn't erase the miraculous birth of Jesus. It actually includes it. And it's a fascinating word that John's going to use to help us get a handle on this big picture. Who was Jesus? And John starts off by claiming, because the other gospels don't start this way. John starts off by claiming he was so unique, one and only of a kind, that he was actually present during the creation. So not only is he going to use the word to affirm, the birth of Jesus, but also any other miraculous aspect of who Jesus is. And to start off with, wow, he was present. He was there in the beginning. So that first preposition in has to do with relationship. We'll put the word in. It's relationship to time. Now, identify for me the next preposition.
With.
Okay. With. Tell me what is being claimed in this phrase. Togetherness, relationship. So who was the word with?
God.
The word was with God. Jesus was, this is what people love to say. Think about this. Jesus participated in and was co-creator. What we don't have in John, I wish there had been a footnote here. Give me a list of those things that Jesus did in the creation. Well, he doesn't answer that question. He's just identified as co-creator with God. Okay? And as co-creator with God, he participates in the creation. When we get to Genesis chapter 1, I noticed this morning there is a heavy emphasis in chapter 1, not only of what God did, and we've talked about that, and God's creative power, but in verse 2, the Spirit is also mentioned, the Spirit of God. And we're going to talk about, when we get to that point, what was the Spirit's role? Because it's kind of fascinating what little bit of information we get in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 of what the Spirit's role was in creation. So the second preposition is with. The word was with God. What else? Remember, I used the word co-creator. Some people talk about the instrumentality of Jesus being co-creator, that it was through him. Through him, all things were made. He participated and somehow was the channel through which, notice through, that's an interesting relationship. It means you become a channel. Things go through you. Or sometimes in Greek, this word through can mean by means of. And if he means here by means of, then again, you're going back to the relationship. The Jews would never have understood it that way. When the Christian goes back and reads the creation story, think of what's the best word to use? We read it with colored glasses through Jesus. And think about how when we're going to be reading in Genesis, it's going to help us appreciate so much more that we come at the entire book of Genesis through Christian lens. So many things will make sense. For example, when we get to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, now I've never done a study of this. I'd love to if I ever had time. Is to look at how Jewish rabbinical tradition thought that what Genesis 3:15 might refer to. Where the serpent's going to get its head crushed by the heel of the one who was bruised. I can guess, but I'm not quite sure. I haven't done any study on that. But I guarantee you, Jesus wasn't in the picture. So when you and I go back and we look at Genesis 3:15, we know exactly what that prophecy refers to. So it is interesting that through the lens of faith, when we go back and look at so many things in the book of Genesis, we recognize two things. One, there's a continuity between creation and the book of Genesis and so many things related to our faith as Christians. And then the second thing is the background in Genesis provides so much depth of meaning for New Testament concepts. So we'll look at both of those when we get to some very significant things. But you're exactly right, Janie. And when we go back and we see where God says, let us make man in our image, we know in a heartbeat what that is.
See, that's one reason people study Bible study.
Oh,
Because when I've been in Genesis and I've seen our image, how can it be our image of God? And blah, blah, blah. Now it's see, I'm like,
yeah. Well, yeah, it's helpful to know some of these insights, isn't it? Okay, do you see through him? The word without in verse 3 is more of a word of negation, not a preposition of place. It's like without something. Although it might have it's a fascinating concept. It would almost be a preposition of negation so that there is no relationship. It's kind of fascinating. In him was life, this is verse 4, and that life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness understood it not. Notice the preposition in verse 5. The light shines in the darkness. Now, this is an important concept and phrase because when we get back to Genesis chapter 1, we start working through some of those early verses, darkness is going to play a role in the picture of creation. And it is so fascinating to me that through the Bible, evil, the incomplete work of God, or things that really haven't been acted upon by God, sin. I mean, it's amazing how this concept of darkness is always distinguished from light. And we're going to look at how that the creation narrative framing darkness sets the foundation for a whole lot of other concepts that will spring from darkness that are antithetical to the will of God. You know what's amazing to me? I just thought about this. I love this class because thoughts come up that I hadn't thought about before. You know what just occurred to me? It was not God's will that the earth remain without form and void, and darkness be upon the deep. That's what was there. Wasn't God's will for that to stay like that. He wanted something different. So what he does, see, this is something else you'll see all through Genesis. God not only pronouncing, but also activating his will. You're going to see what happens when God wills something. And all through Genesis, this comes up. When God wills something, the human will is not going to make it stop. Now, there is the recognition, though, that when human beings, out of a relationship with God where they're crying out to God in agony, or they're asking God for things to change, a prayerful human will can change the mind of God. So much so that when Abraham tries to go into Sodom and Gomorrah and negotiate with God that he not destroy that city, if I can find 50 right, it's going to be cool when we get to that story. If I can find 50 righteous, Lord, will you not? Okay. Well, I don't know exactly what all criteria that Abraham used, but then he comes back to God and he says, no, I couldn't find 50. Would you go with 40? So he keeps going down, negotiating with God. And God keeps saying, yeah, if you can find them. He couldn't find them. So we'll talk about that. And that's a fascinating insight into the nature of the will of God that's changed by prayerful human will that still seeks the will of God. So it has some powerful dimensions related to our thought world as it relates to prayer and the will of God. So we have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word, let's go back to what Agnes said. Here we have an equation. Equal. The Word the Word was God. Now, there are two words, and I think I mentioned this when we get into Genesis 1. We're going to lay the foundation for asking more questions about the nature of God. In Genesis, there are two names for God. One is God, and here we see it, in the beginning was God. The other is, and many Bibles will have in all capital letters the word Lord. I think the King James Version, instead of saying Lord, used the word Jehovah. So they would say Jehovah. And the reason that happens is because this word right here, I think it's interesting when you do the word Lord, because in Hebrew it is 4 letters. Nobody knows what that word means. Some people try to transliterate it when you pronounce it Yahweh or Jehovah. Other people just say Lord. Well, when the Hebrew scribes and the cantors would come along and they see that word in the Hebrew text, they would put over to the side Lord. And instead of pronouncing out loud Jehovah, they would pronounce the word Adonai over in the margin, which is the word Lord. They had such a reverence that, and I've read this, I don't know how true it is yet. I'm still trying to track this down. So if you find a resource, please let me know. I've heard that tradition says that when the scribes were copying the Old Testament, when they came to the word Lord, they would pick up a pen and quill as they were writing, and they would use only that pen for the word Jehovah. Then they would lay it back down, use another pen for the rest of the text. That's how much supposedly they reverence the name Lord. Nancy?
I think Christians do the same thing in their right. I know whenever I journal, if ever I am referring to God, it's always capital.
Yes. Yeah.
It has to be capitalized in
Yeah.
my journal.
Yeah.
And I always write it large.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Yeah.
Loving
Well,
letters.
it's kind of funny we're talking about this. If you're writing a letter or you're sending email or something, and you write the word God, God bless me today, and you're talking about that, that's fine. What I wouldn't feel comfortable doing is writing it with a little g. I grew up, that's blasphemous. That's just our habit and tradition. And I see people on the internet and email all the time using the word God with a small g, and that just bothers me. Now, that's just me, so I'm not going to say anything to them, because literally in both the Hebrew and the Greek, the word God is in small letters. I would say that the person who uses the expression, the man upstairs, in kind of a popular way, is recognizing, okay, God's in heaven. They may be even saying, this is the mysterious God. I don't know what God's up to. It's just the man upstairs. It kind of reminds me of the classic little booklet. If you ever can find one, it's really worth your time reading. J.B. Phillips, many years ago, 1952 maybe, wrote a book called Your God is Too Small. And what he did in that little booklet, the first half of it, he took popular images that people would say about God, and he shows how they're inadequate. For example, man upstairs would be one of them. He also talks about the old man with the long beard sitting on the throne, how that's inadequate. And he goes through every image that people sort of on a popular level will talk about God. Oh, some people use the word heavenly policeman. So in his day and time, there were a whole bunch of ways that people refer to God. And he says, none of those are adequate. And he sort of provides what would be the best? He provides guidance to give you ideas to think about when you're actually going through scripture trying to figure out who God is. So now, this is so important here because when we think about who God is, God and Jehovah, this word for Lord, they don't know how to translate. Even the Hebrews didn't know what to do with it. It's a word that looks like, because of the structure of the word, it looks like both a noun and a verb, and it's really strange. And what I have thought through the years is that it affirms the eternal nature of God. And it basically comes from the verb to be, but they don't want to do with it. So I think it's four ideas in one. Because remember where Jesus talks about I am, it kind of comes from this verb I am. God is the great I am. God is who he is. God is who he was. God is who he will be. And God will be who he always was. All of these ideas about the existence of God I think are all within this word Lord. And that's why it's so strange they don't know what to do with it, because it's a word that just contains all of these perspectives on the eternal nature of God. It's really powerful. It's coming from our human history of someone being in a role of being sort of sovereign or master over people, and without caring about them, they'll just enforce their will on people.
Well, see, that's the opposite of.
Well, it is. See, here's what we're going to find I think it's great you brought that up. Here's what we're going to find in Genesis, and it really explodes in the rest of the Old Testament. God as Lord cares for his people. And you're going to see that. Here's what's cool. Even when Adam and Eve sin, God still does something that cares for them. He could have said, oh my goodness, the two people I created they messed this thing messed it up so bad, I'm going to start over with two more Adam and Eves. My original Adam and Eve, they so messed it up, I'm going to start over. Well, when they mess it up, there's something that God does that demonstrates his deep care for his creation. So the idea of Lord and caring for creation are woven together. There's so many things that come in the Old Testament. When God is Lord, if his people reject him and rebel against him, there will be curses. And you're going to see that all through the Old Testament. They're identified as curses. Guess what happens? When Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, God comes to them and talks to them what their consequences are going to be. What's the consequence for Adam? Do you remember? The ground, the earth is cursed. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the temptation. I believe something happened to the earth, not just Adam and Eve. Something happened. And we're going to talk about that. Well, it does. And what I'm claiming is it doesn't negate the Lord caring at all. In fact, the Lord who has the sovereign rule over Adam and Eve demonstrated care. And it sets you up. Think about as you go through the Bible and in your own study, God is Lord of your life. What are all the ways that he demonstrates care? Lord does not negate care. Lord encapsulates care. So this is important. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Now let's turn to Colossians 1:16 and let's see what Paul says about God and Christ related to the creation. In verse 14 of chapter 1 of Colossians, he's been talking about how Jesus has rescued us from the dominion of darkness. Ooh, there's the word darkness. Remember, I talked about how so many times in the New Testament, the idea of darkness comes up as it's over against the word light. He's rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Now, that's statements that's regarding redemption. And what he does when he stops there, Paul then wants to talk about the nature of this Jesus who had so much a part of our redemption. He is the image of the invisible God. That first phrase is incredible because can you see something that's invisible? No, that's why you have the word invisible. Well, guess what? Jesus was the image of the invisible God. If we, I heard it's put this way one time. Jesus came to earth to put a face on God for us. This is interesting, isn't it? He's the image of the invisible God. Notice, he's the firstborn over all creation. So we have a preposition here, don't we? Over. But he is the firstborn over all creation. That phrase has caused a lot of controversy in historic Christianity. So are you telling me that Jesus was somehow born and he was the firstborn? See, it's strange language. What do you make of it? How would you explain to someone that he's the firstborn over all creation? There are strains of thought in historic Christianity that have tried to make the case of that. That the reason Jesus is son is because he was firstborn and God created the son. When we say firstborn, what do we typically, where does our mind go about someone being firstborn? Typically, we think it's the oldest in a bunch of siblings, the firstborn. That's kind of how we use it. Well, here, Jesus being the firstborn over all creation, it represents, with the place and role of a firstborn, there was recognition of authority and reception of blessings. So Jesus participating in creation, being co-creator and part of creation, there was some authority in that role and blessings that he enjoyed as the firstborn over all creation. It's really an amazing phrase. I don't think we need to get hung up on it, but it's just an insight into who Jesus is being identified as he's part of the creation and he's over the creation. This is not denying anything relating to, but see, that's where the controversy was in the past. People thought it was denying that. And you're like, no, let's go back and look at the ways in which this word can be used. Authority, responsibility, blessings, position. You know what it almost reminds me of? Remember in Philippians 2, where it says Jesus, though he was in heaven at the right hand of God, he didn't think it anything to be held on to. But he became as a man and came to earth, took on the form of servant, was crucified, died, crucified, raised, and ascended back to God. So that's part of his role as firstborn and being over all creation. In fact, in that passage in Philippians 2, guess what? There's going to come a time when all creation will kneel and proclaim that he is Lord. Well, that's part of his being firstborn over all creation. Oh, it's time to quit. Okay, we will pick up there next week. Thanks for all of your participation and insights.